This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, journalist Katherine Mangu-Ward on libertarianism and national security.
You always want to devolve decision-making to the lowest possible level because that's the place where people understand the stakes the most. Sometimes that's the individual, but in cases where it isn't the individual, you still would prefer local government to state government to federal government to global institutions. So for the first little while that I was working there, I would get these like cold calls and it would be like Paul Wolfowitz just on the phone for Bill Sapphire or like Martha Stewart. Keeping trade as free as possible is a super important way of being engaged in the world, and that too often we are willing to forfeit that and also, set up our bases or pick our fights or whatever it is abroad in ways that are really unproductive.
Katherine Mangu-Ward, welcome to Chatter.
I could not be happier to be here.
I'm so happy to have you in studio.
It's very nice to see a person's face when we're about to talk some nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. So and I just realized something. This is a very auspicious occasion because in the, I think, 20 years that you and I have known each other, we have appeared on panels together.
Yes.
We have appeared in video interviews together. You've interviewed me in a video before. We have co-hosted a movie together in front of an audience.
Yes.
We've never been on a podcast together.
There's a first time for everything.
This is it. This is so exciting. I listen to you on your podcast all the time on the Reason Roundtable, but we've just never joined these forces. I'm excited.
It's basically the Avengers.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much so. Are you an Avengers fan? I can't remember.
I am. I wish I wasn't. I wish I had the taste that was more elevated than what Marvel wants to stuff down my throat, and I don't.
Okay.
I'm just a mainstream gal.
They're both very foreign franchises to me. Like I've seen the one with Benedict Cumberbatch. Which one is that?
Doctor Strange.
Is that Marvel?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh my God.
I don't know. They all mix up together.
You're like those German spies that get caught because they don't know baseball statistics. That's you.
That's me. My cover in Berlin is blown. Or I guess no, it would be in Brooklyn.
Your cover in Omaha is blown.
I don't know that I would make a great spy. I don't know.
It's sort of a shame for someone who spent so much time thinking and talking about the conduct of spies.
You would think so. People have asked me, they're like, would you ever want to join the CIA? I did this it was in front of the deputy director of the CIA once and the public affairs person. And he was like, would you ever want to come work here? And I said, well, I definitely wouldn't want to work in the press office. And it was like,
rude.
It was very rude of me. But we're not going to talk about that today. We are going to talk about libertarian ideas, foreign policy, the libertarian position of the world. You are uniquely in my world, situated to talk about this because you are the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, the magazine for free minds and free ideas. Do I have this right?
So close. Free minds and free markets.
Free minds and free markets. But I think fair to say, leading libertarian journal / magazine in America on these subjects. So we're going to get into all of that. But I want to start talking about you. I know you, but the readers don't. But hopefully I'll learn something new about you in the process. Talk to us about where you grew up. And when you were growing up, what was your interaction with politics, libertarian or otherwise? What is the political atmosphere that you grow up in? I
grew up in Washington, D.C. and in the D.C. area. I'm a Beltway baby. Mm-hmm. And as a result, my hometown paper was the Washington Post. So
God bless.
I kind of grew up with a very high ambient level of politics around me, though neither of my parents were explicitly political. My mom worked in public health. My dad was an architect. I went to public school in Alexandria, Virginia, and I did not think of myself as being especially politically engaged, but also in middle school would come home once a week, and when Newsweek had arrived at my house, I would read it immediately after school and fall asleep, and my family would they'd be like, oh, it's the Newsweek nap. This was a
that
known
was what it was called?
Thing.
Was it because it was boring, or just it lulled you?
I think I was just very tired all the time.
Okay.
So, in fact, I would say, fairly politically aware. In my teenage years, I read Ayn Rand, as so many of us do.
Natch.
And became an objectivist, a follower of Ayn Rand, and was, as a consequence, truly insufferable for a couple of years there.
I feel like that kind of goes with the territory when young people read Ayn Rand.
I mean, maybe all 15-year-olds are insufferable.
That's
it's
true.
just which variant you choose.
Yeah.
But that was my chosen variant.
Yeah. Mine was J.D. Salinger, but
same problem. A bunch of phonies, all of us. And my parents were appalled because they are both kind of like good government DC liberals,
Right.
and kind of hoped that it was a phase. Tragically, I went to college and kind of left objectivism behind, although I still think Rand gets a bad rap in many ways, and started to think of myself as a libertarian and as a journalist, actually.
And what about libertarianism drew you in? What resonated?
So I think fundamentally it's the kind of the individualism, first and foremost, the idea that people are and should be thought of as individuals with kind of equal moral worth. And I think that a lot of people start in that place and end up very different places. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that drew me in initially to objectivism and then to libertarianism is that it is a complete system for thinking about the world that's internally consistent. And that's important to me. I think that there are too many people who want to believe A and not A at the same time in their politics. They kind of hold contradictory views and then get upset when that doesn't work out in reality. I think, the word freedom, everybody wants to own that word. Everyone wants to claim that word. But for me, it kind of starts with the idea of people should be free to choose the lives that they want to live. They should be, have self-determination, and that as much as possible, their lives should be based around consent rather than force. The people who you do business with should want to do business with you, and the things that you buy should be things you want to buy, and the people that you love should be the people you want to love, and the people you live with should be the people you want to live with. And as much as possible, that shouldn't be the business of the government.
Were there libertarian writers or thinkers that were the first you encountered as you were kind of forming your own relationship to that idea?
Yeah, so I came up in college in what's sometimes called the fusionist tradition. So this is kind of the idea that there are a lot of thinkers, especially in the kind of early and mid 20th century, who appeal to both a certain kind of conservative who unfortunately is now a bit of an endangered species, but also to libertarians. So these are people like Hayek, Friedrich Hayek and other thinkers in the Austrian School of Economics, economics generally, sort of Milton Friedman, those type of folks who kind of cross over into various political philosophical traditions. I'm also, read at that time David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, who is an anarchist thinker and someone from whom I draw a lot of inspiration as well. And
you went to Yale. Was libertarianism a powerful strain at Yale, or were you kind of off on your own?
I would say more powerful than you might think.
Okay.
That is to say that there really was a community within the Yale Political Union, which was the debating society I was a member of there. There really was a community of thinkers who were not kind of, this was the late 90s and early aughts. I like to say that I was in college at the end of history. Like nothing was happening. The stakes were weirdly zero for most of my college career.
Yeah.
And in a way that was great because the political really wasn't very personal at that time. People would lament that there was nothing to protest.
Yeah.
And I think it's so foreign to where we are now.
Oh, God. Well, especially at Yale, but in college campuses around the country, really.
And so that gave a lot of space for kind of intellectual experimentation. And people were very tolerant in many ways of differing views. So there was space for libertarianism. I would not say it was a dominant ideology.
But were you kind of like probably falling more into people who are on the right of the political spectrum? And then within that, are you kind of like, like the rare orchid that's floating around with the conservatives?
You sweet talker, you. No, so I actually do think this is an important kind of point to establish, and it'll be relevant, I think, to the rest of our conversation, which is that libertarians in general, and certainly this is how I view it, really don't think of ourselves as being on the left-right spectrum. And so, I think this is a common confusion that has its origin, actually, in the Cold War, when libertarians and conservatives were kind of in an uneasy alliance, right? If there's one thing that libertarians and conservatives agree on, it's that communism sucks.
Right.
Real bad. and so there was a period when in the American political kind of conversation, libertarians and conservatives were often, in kind of an alliance. But I disagree with the kind of American right-wing views on things about as much as I disagree with the American left.
Yeah.
And I think that comes out, we were saying earlier that Reason's motto is free minds and free markets. And, the idea of what was once described as, fiscally conservative and socially liberal, that used to be a thing people said as a way of describing libertarianism. That's incoherent now because conservatives aren't fiscally responsible and liberals no longer believe in civil liberties. So it's a whole mess. But part of the reason for using that descriptor is to highlight that libertarians really don't fit in on the left or the right, and really haven't since at least the tail end of the Cold War, which I think is when the story of American libertarianism really begins. Right.
And we'll get to that in a second too. But I want to just spend a moment on then what is your introduction to journalism? Because you have these political beliefs and then they get channeled into the profession that you're in now. So what was your introduction to journalism when you were in college, and had you always wanted to be a journalist?
Absolutely. I had not always wanted to be a journalist. In fact, I had several journalism jobs before I realized that maybe I should be a journalist, which is the opposite, I think, of a lot of people's experience in our profession. I worked on a tabloid-style alternative paper in college called the Yale Free Press. I suppose we should put a disclosure here. Another colleague of mine on that paper was your husband,
correct.
Shane. But we honestly were just joking around. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a fun project that we would do in a weekend once a month. And it was a lot of satirical content, a lot of kind of campus reporting, just a weird mix of stuff. And, I perceived that to be part of the kind of intellectual project that I was doing in my debating society, in my academic work. I didn't really see it as a career-defining move, but in fact, in retrospect, it was. And a lot of the skills that I used on the Yale Free Press are now the very ones that I practice day to day as editor-in-chief of Reason. My husband, has always described the way he's described it sounds a lot to me like the comedy troupe that I was in, where we were being provocative and having a good time. And we were actually trying to crack each other up in addition to kind of making other people think and make them laugh. It sounds like it was just kind of like a rollicking good time. It absolutely was. Our print run, I wish I could remember what our print run was, but it was enough that we could sort of distribute big stacks all around campus. And it's not clear to me that anyone read them. It was generally considered...
It wasn't the campus newspaper.
It was not the main campus newspaper. It was generally considered a success if one of the issues got burned in anger. That was, people started a bonfire with the paper. That was a real win. But we did do some real journalism as well. That was the thing about it that made it kind of fun, is that sometimes we would end up stumbling into a little scandal about departmental funding or something about a campus group that was worth exposing. So we did do a little real journalism as well, and I suppose that's where I got the taste.
And when did you get to Reason?
So I was actually an intern at Reason in the summer of 2000. So I had a couple other jobs in between, including at the Weekly Standard magazine and at the New York Times in the D.C. bureau.
Right. And Bill Kristol was the editor of the Weekly Standard at the time?
That's right.
Yeah.
And in both of those places, I was kind of like a pet libertarian, a curiosity. So I was at the Weekly Standard when the Weekly Standard started the war in Iraq, you could say, which was a very, very interesting time to be there. But I was never a neocon in any kind of meaningful sense.
Were you opposed to the invasion?
I actually talked myself into a corner of kind of being in favor from a libertarian perspective. And we can talk about that a little more because I think it's worth exploring, because it does kind of get into the ways in which you can tell a libertarian story that can get you to very different foreign policy conclusions.
Okay.
But yeah, I would say I was pro-war, and having been what I now perceive to be so radically wrong about both the justifications for war and the potential outcomes has really shaped a lot of my thinking going forward.
And you're not alone in that camp. I mean, I think a lot of people who in the intelligence community who made the judgments about the cause of that war now feel like, wow, we fucked that one up.
I hope they learned some lessons too.
I hope so too. I'm not entirely confident. Was it weird being like the libertarian at the New York Times, by the way? Was that an issue for you, or do you proudly wear the badge?
So when I worked at the New York Times, I worked for John Tierney
Right.
when he was an op-ed columnist. He had been on the Metro side. He had done a bunch of science writing, and it was his first year as a columnist, and he was allowed to hire an assistant. And so he hired me. They kept us opinion folks segregated from the newsroom, like physically segregated in case our opinions like tainted the news.
Totally. Waft in the air, aerosolized.
So the result was that, I had an office across the hall from Maureen Dowd and down the hall from Tom Friedman. Like it was actually quite a cool experience for
like the Murderer's Row, yeah.
Early
Bill
in their
Sapphire
career.
and yeah.
So actually, a fun little story is that I started very, very shortly after Bill Sapphire retired. And so I had his phone number.
Really?
So for the first little while that I was working there, I would get these like cold calls, and it would be like Paul Wolfowitz just on the phone for Bill Sapphire, or like Martha Stewart. And it was like, I just had to disappoint them every time. I was like, I'm very sorry, but I have nothing for you.
That's awesome.
So I got a taste of the kind of New York Times life in many ways, including the incredible phenomenon where when you call and say, I am calling from the New York Times, you get that interview.
That's right.
People pick that phone right up.
That's right.
But I was quite separate from the newsroom, and so in some ways did not have the full experience.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, and we can maybe weave in your experiences at Reason too into this, but at a very high level, take this as high as you want. What is the libertarian? We could say Libertarian Party or Libertarian. I'm going to let you guide me on how we should be thinking about this. General take on position on U.S. foreign policy, right? We can sort of well, maybe not so much Republicans and Democrats, but to the degree that we've been able to sort of bullet point or shorthand the major two political parties, how should we be thinking about big old libertarianism and the U.S. in the world?
So, I do think we should start with the distinction between libertarianism and the Libertarian Party, because perhaps more so even than the way that we think about the American left and right and the Democrats and Republicans, there are some kind of subtleties there, in part because it's the same word. We use the same word for the ideology and for the party, but the party is not synonymous with the ideology. So I am not a member of the Libertarian Party. I have never been a member of the Libertarian Party. And typically we say, I'm a small L libertarian.
Okay.
As opposed
that's a thing.
Yes, that's a thing. So I am a small L libertarian, and one reason for that is because, unlike the major parties, the Libertarian Party is unfortunately bedeviled by the problems that any third party would have. So it's weird and fringy, and they have a lot of internal turmoil. And I would love to live in a world where the Libertarian Party was a big deal in American politics, but for a lot of reasons, some of which are structurally stacked against the LP, that is not the case.
Right.
So I do want to bracket the Libertarian Party does have a foreign policy plank in its party platform. And that is a perfectly reasonable place to start, which is that they are very, very anti-war, anti-interventionist, anti-war in quite a robust way. But I think the other piece of this, the kind of small L libertarian piece, is that there are a lot of libertarians, and I'm one of them, who would say there kind of isn't a libertarian foreign policy. And that is reflected in polls. So I think just before we get into my views, to be fair to other libertarians, I do want to say when you poll people who identify as libertarians, their views on foreign policy are basically indistinguishable from the general populations. So you get people who will say right direction, wrong direction, or more interventionist, less interventionist, in kind of the same mix that you get in the general population. So my belief, and I think this is borne out in some of this polling, is that it comes from different places. It comes from very different principles. But it's not as if all libertarians are anti-war and non-interventionist. So, I do want to kind of flag that.
Right.
I would say like the beginning of the story of libertarian foreign policy basically starts with a burning draft card, right? So, the Vietnam War breaks out, this kind of always tenuous relationship between Cold War conservatives and libertarians starts to fray, and libertarians end up being part of the founding of Students for a Democratic Society. The 1969 meeting of Young Americans for Liberty basically ends in a riot because kids are burning their draft cards. And libertarians quite universally would say that the draft is wrong, that conscription is deeply immoral, that it's basically slavery, and that a just state cannot pursue it. So I think that's kind of a good bedrock to start from. And one reason that libertarians say that is because war is good for the state, right? So Milton Friedman, who's kind of the patron saint of modern libertarianism in a lot of ways, said at the end of his life that his greatest accomplishment was helping to end the draft. I mean, he won a Nobel Prize, right? But to him, that was a big deal. States get bigger in wartime, and libertarians do not like their states big. And so, that kind of leads to this fundamental opposition to war where it's avoidable. The flip side of that is that libertarians believe really, really strongly in self-defense, right? So libertarians generally favor strong gun rights for that reason. They, often favor strong and very clear property rights that you can then kind of consider part of your purview of your self-defense. So wars of self-defense are usually considered kind of A-okay in the libertarian point of view. If you're protecting yourself or your country, okay. But anything where you're kind of going abroad, anything where you're going to kind of impose your will, left libertarians are often very anti-imperialist. They see problems in that direction. But right libertarians will also, be anti-war often because it is kind of a waste of money and a kind of inappropriate imposition of force on other people.
And how do we distinguish our left and right libertarians?
So this is kind of the free minds half and the free markets half. That's one way to think about it. So people who really focus on the protection of civil liberties are often identified as left libertarians. These are people who care a lot about privacy, who care a lot about bodily autonomy, who care a lot about maybe anti-imperialism. That's kind of the lefter cluster of libertarians, and the right-leaning libertarians are often going to be people who care more about debt and deficit, keeping taxes low, regulation on markets minimal, that kind of thing. Most libertarians are a mix, right? I would say everything I just listed there, I'm basically all of those things described.
Yeah. And so you could take each one of those categories, and if you took the word libertarian out of it, people might think that you were describing a mainstream Democrat and a mainstream Republican.
Right.
But what's the kind of commonality, though, for a libertarian that distinguishes them from the other two? Or is that not so important?
I think in some ways it's combining those things. It's seeing those things as both stemming from the same place, which is a commitment to kind of maximizing personal choice, maximizing personal freedom, and respecting the individual.
So on the question of libertarians being pro self-defense in war. So is the attack on Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, is that one that libertarians are generally in favor of because it was a response and we're going after al-Qaeda, which is being harbored by the Taliban?
So, yes, immediately you get into what does that mean? How do you apply that? And it immediately becomes very, very messy.
Okay.
And so, I think
life is, so that's good.
Turns out. I think if we imagine a scenario in which the territorial U.S. is invaded, libertarians are ready to fight,
right?
And by the way, have a lot of guns, so they're going to.
That is good. They're ready. They personally might be ready to fight,
right? They are both morally and logistically ready to fight. But the minute that you start talking about retaliation, which is another way you might describe what happened with Afghanistan, it gets trickier. So I think. The vast majority of libertarians, certainly, I would say, our extended engagement in Afghanistan was a catastrophic disaster. And I think libertarians got to that critique much more quickly than the mainstream did. I think there were libertarians, even at the time, even immediately post 9/11, who said, we're thinking about this wrongly to think about it as a matter of going after a state actor, right? Because another thing that libertarians think about a lot is the distinction between the individual and the state in which they live. Mm-hmm. So was Afghanistan responsible for what bin Laden did? It's kind of a stretch. And I think in retrospect appears to be much more of a stretch than it felt like it was at the time.
Right.
In general, the war on terror, I think, is such a fantastic example of the thing libertarians worry about when we worry about war being the health of the state. So not only did we end up in a 20-year, incredibly expensive, in the end, functionally pointless engagement abroad, we also sacrificed a huge amount at home, right? So the Patriot Act is something that libertarians have fought valiantly and mostly unsuccessfully to stop and then reverse. This is, the TSA, like the Department of Homeland Security, like all of these kind of appendages of the national security state, many of which grew out of the war on terror, ended up really infringing on Americans' liberties. And for what? Mm-hmm. Like the math ain't mathin', as the kids probably don't say anymore.
They probably don't say it, but they should.
And so I think that idea of, should there have been some retaliation for those attacks? Maybe, but was invading a sovereign nation and then staying for 20 years the right approach? Definitely not.
And it seems like, especially with the value of hindsight, but I mean, you could have, one maybe did say it at the time, that the libertarian message there to the public would be, have the courage not to go too far, right? If you want to go to Afghanistan, kill bin Laden, root out al-Qaeda, maybe topple the Taliban because they were harboring him, great. But having a presence there where we have to sort of, we convince ourselves that no, we have to be here as a counterterrorism kind of forced projection, probably wrong idea. Taking the shoes off at the airport, it's security theater. I think even people who run the TSA believe that at this point. So is that part of it, is kind of like saying to people, look, the smarter thing, but also the harder thing, maybe too, a more courageous thing, is to just say, don't intervene too much, like just to the point where it's necessary for your immediate self-defense.
Yeah. So again, some libertarians are going to be absolutists on this. They're just going to say, how you know it's self-defense? When somebody else has a gun pointed at you.
Yeah.
And everything else is not.
Right.
But I think a lot of libertarians would say something more like, we just need dramatically more humility in our foreign policy. And I think that's what kind of covers this thing that you're highlighting, right? That we just need to understand. And this is a fundamental tenet of libertarianism as well. The government's pretty bad at stuff. Like, it just screws up a lot of what it tries to do, and it does so expensively and in ways that end up being very drawn out. Yeah. And so you kind of want to hold this baseline idea in your mind of, like, the question isn't, if this was done perfectly, would it be the right thing to do? The question is, if the U.S. government, as we know it to actually exist, does this thing, is it the right thing to do? And that's a very, very different threshold, right? And so I think when you ask yourself that question, as I should have, about the Iraq War, the answer is very different. So, not to jump ahead, but...
No, this is actually, I was going to ask you next. So tell me about Iraq and why you were talked into the corner of supporting it.
So I think, at that time, there was this kind of idea, okay, this is going to be brief and glorious.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're going to go in. It's going to be surgical. We're going to get out. And we will have liberated millions of people who are living under the yoke of a truly horrific tyrant.
Yep.
And that story, as far as it goes, not only does it sort of match the template in some ways of some of the U.S.'s more glorious wars, right? I mean, we could say, like, well, that's sort of the story of World War II, only it was actually really hard. But, like, the liberating of other peoples, right? Because I am a cosmopolitan libertarian, right? So one thing that I would say is I think human lives all around the world, all people deserve freedom and autonomy and self-determination. Not just American. Like, just because you happen to be born within the borders of the United States,
right.
why do you get rights and nobody else? And so I think if you have that mindset, you say, well, maybe if it is going to be so little cost to us and it would mean so much to these people, maybe this is something to do that like net increases liberty in the world. And I think a lot of people actually ask that question about foreign policy, not just libertarians. Like, will this make lots of people more free? Will it mean more people live lives of, of genuine possibility in a way that they don't now? So at that time, I think I kind of bought the propaganda, both that our kind of mission there would be very, very clear, that it would be brief, that we could be effective and get out. Of course, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, at the same time that I was making these arguments to myself and others about how the U.S. could very, very efficiently accomplish this goal, I was also writing articles about how we can't even get it together to like low-key reform Social Security, right? Or like that our policing it was a mess of corruption and violence and and that our tax code was unnecessarily complicated and that no one could figure out how to untangle it, and that the technology underlying its enforcement was antiquated, and that everyone was just covering their asses. Like, all those same critiques totally apply to the Department of Defense.
Right.
And
which doesn't have a history of running countries.
No, certainly not. There was also, I would say, an additional libertarian critique of that war and of many wars in our memory, which is that they're almost always done in a fairly unconstitutional way, right? And so many libertarians would say, hey, the Constitution is pretty good. The U.S. Constitution is a pretty good document in terms of a framework for running a libertarian country. And the problem is just that we're constantly violating it. So, like, where was the congressional authorization for all of these wars? Where, are we just in a chronic state of emergency? What does that mean for how we put constraints on the state? So there's also, I would say, like a procedural critique of that war that got overlooked in the rush to action. And some libertarians did not make the mistake I did. There were libertarians who opposed that war from the start.
Yeah. Where were libertarians and where were you on the question of whether there was a self-defense component to the war in Iraq, because the intelligence community and the president and Colin Powell and other governments too were saying, Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction. He had in fact gassed his own people before he had demonstrated a capability for mass killing. Did that component of self-defense resonate in yours or others' calculation that, we should probably do this war, presuming it's going to be quick and surgical and all the rest?
I think it resonated across the spectrum. I think lots of people really kind of believed that justification. And, what it unfortunately did is open up this kind of rhetorical path where whenever any kind of foreign adventurism is on the table, someone who's trying to sell it, somebody who wants it to happen, is always going to try and make the case that it's self-defense. And we've seen that, we've even seen that in conflicts where that argument is far more attenuated. We have to go into Libya for self-defense. We have to, so I think that, probably it is right that we should have a little more immunity to the self-defense argument when it is a stretch. In retrospect, was Saddam Hussein about to nuke the United States?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Right.
I also do think, I'm of the age where that doesn't feel like it happened that long ago.
Yeah.
But it was a while ago, and it was much closer to when the Cold War was sort of at its peak and robustly underway. And there was this legitimate question of how much any of what we were doing abroad was fundamentally self-defense, because we could get nuked by Russia at any time. We could get nuked by the Soviets at any time. And I think that infected a lot of the thinking of the foreign policy establishment and of the American people. Libertarians have never been represented in any of those kind of decision-making bodies. And so I just think there wasn't a voice saying, hey, is this really self-defense?
Yeah. Has there been a libertarian or an LP member in the Congress before?
Yes. So Justin Amash, who is a representative from Michigan,
of course,
was initially elected as a Republican and switched his party ID to Libertarian. There are lots of folks who describe themselves as Libertarian as an adjective over the years in Congress, in both parties, although they tend to be more likely to be Republicans. There are also some people who have described themselves as libertarian historically, and I wouldn't describe them that much that way anymore. So Ron Paul, who was the Libertarian Party nominee a couple of times, served in Congress for a long time as a Republican, undoubtedly libertarian. But his son, Rand Paul, is, of course, now around and does do things that are very libertarian very often, but also holds different views than his father in many ways. So there are people, there tend to be people who are fiscal hawks who will describe themselves as libertarian. In passing, the Tea Party movement was extremely libertarian inflected in its early days before it diverged into some other agendas.
Talk a little bit about that before we get into diverging, because I think people forget this.
Yes.
Right? Because now we associate, I think, the Tea Party with kind of like incipient MAGA, right? But in the beginning, it's not. It has something. It's much more at home in the philosophy that you've been talking about.
Right. So the very, very early days of the Tea Party movement, it really was about the national debt and deficit and about taxes.
Because it was the wake of the financial collapse in 2008. Yeah?
Exactly. So this is kind of a moment when Americans are looking at the financial health of the nation and saying, they still have in recent memory the 90s when we had balanced budgets, when we were kind of looking at something that looked a little bit more like fiscal health, although there were always, entitlement bombs waiting underneath. And they start to get worried about this. And there's sort of the intellectual side of it, which is, hey, we need to reform Social Security and, think again about our healthcare entitlements and old age entitlements because those bills are going to come due and how are we going to pay them? But there was also just kind of the gut level aspect of it, which was like, I want lower taxes.
Right.
Like, I just think government should do less and I want to pay less for it.
Right.
And that's a very popular view among Americans. Lots
absolutely.
of Americans would like the government to do less and for them to pay less for it. Thomas Massey, who is, was part of the kind of group of people who would use libertarian for themselves as an adjective, a Kentucky congressman, he has the best explanation for this phenomenon and how it evolved, which is to say, initially there were these kind of people who were a more small government types who were excited about fiscal discipline and about shrinking the size of the state. But, then you started to see the sign that was like government hands off my Medicare. That was like the kind of the turning point in some ways. And then this kind of emergence of other priorities, including the kind of Trumpist populism that it segued from. Thomas Massey's explanation is that he was wrong about the Tea Party, essentially. And the quote is, they weren't voting for libertarian ideas. They were voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the race. And I think that that's the piece of it that I undervalued at the time and that many people did, that people just knew that what was going on in D.C. sucked. And they were like, let's break this up. Let's do something different. And it manifested in this kind of small government Tea Party for a minute. But now it's manifested in kind of a nationalist populism that is decidedly unlibertarian.
Did you take from that there was something about libertarianism that was innately attractive to populists? Like, why did they get on your float in the parade?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that I wouldn't say innately attractive to populists, but I would say that there is something very American that libertarianism touches on and is, flows from. That there is this kind of fundamental idea that you're not the boss of me.
Yeah.
And to the extent that populism is also that, that's where there's crossover. But, in some ways, populism is a mass movement, and it's often very, very based on your demographic identity. So, whether it's kind of we have to restore the white middle class or whatever it is, libertarians are, as I've said, tend to be more individualist. And so it's not what group am I a member of, and should that group be in charge, or should policies be made for that group? It's how do we respect individuals? How do we let people live the lives they want to live? How do we leave people alone? And so I think that's a really important distinction between, what I would see as American libertarianism and the kind of populism that is on the rise, not just in the U.S., but all around the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting. What I think about what I misjudged about the Tea Party was I presumed in the beginning, and maybe there were people who felt this way or who were in that early movement, that what we were really kind of dealing with here were almost like nihilists, that they wanted to go in the government to tear it down, which struck me as counterproductive. But that's just my view on it. And then I kind of came to the feeling that, no, they're just populists. They want to control the government to make it the tool for making everyone else live the way they want to live, which is like that's what people generally do when they run for offices. You get power of the state so that you can do what you want. I wonder, like, did the wave of populists that kind of overtake that moment, does that make the other libertarians like Tom Massey say, oh, screw this, and we're just back to doing libertarianism on our own? Or did people try and influence that movement and stop the rise of someone like Trump?
So people went both ways.
Okay.
There's been kind of a divide, and some people who would previously have identified as libertarians have gone all in on essentially kind of authoritarian populism. We're gonna take the power for the people, and the people are understood as whatever you want it to be.
People like us, yeah.
But I would say the thing that you saw as nihilism, I saw as like a kind of a viable way of thinking about the state.
Exactly.
Which is. The state cannot do everything.
Right.
The federal government cannot do everything effectively. It might not be able to do anything effectively,
right,
but it certainly can't do everything and be everything to everyone. And so the only reasonable and responsible question is, what should the government do less of?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can't afford everything that it is doing right now. And so that means we have to do less of a bunch of things in order to make this work out. And, my feeling, and I think a lot of people's feeling, is, oh, yeah, I can think of a bunch of things that the government is involved in that it needn't be. And one of those things might be the governance of Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. One of those things might be trying to be the world's policeman. One of those things might be acting as a force to set the rules about who can trade with who and who can travel where and who can emigrate or immigrate. Like, there are many, many places where you might say, hey, maybe the U.S. government isn't the right entity to be thinking and talking about this, and maybe the U.S. taxpayers aren't the right people to be funding this.
If you take that piece of maybe we should be thinking, maybe the word is humble, but about the United States government, the military, not as powerful as you think, not as great as affecting world events and controlling things. It strikes me that one person in prominent leadership over the past 15 years who believed that was actually Barack Obama. He didn't always govern that way. I mean, you could make the argument that, obviously we stayed in Afghanistan, continuation of the war in Iraq. I would love to know what you think about the libertarian view on the drone program. Maybe let's put a button in that for a second, because this touches so many hot points for people of all political persuasion. But it seemed to me that Obama always had this fundamental belief that people vastly overestimate the power of the United States government and the foreign policy apparatus to control world events. I'm curious if you agree with that, but that also seems to me to be like a very libertarian point of view.
Yeah, I don't think there are too many people that would say that Obama was a libertarian.
It was a slight provocation.
But I think the idea of having a more humble foreign policy, precisely because there are limits on kind of just the capacity of the U.S., is a very libertarian idea.
Yeah.
Libertarians were and are very, very, very troubled by the drone program and by extrajudicial killings.
Yeah.
This is sort of a classic example of concerns about executive overreach and about secrecy in the state, right? And so I think the idea that the American public needs to have visibility on what we are doing abroad, what the U.S. government is doing abroad, what the U.S. military is doing abroad, and that we really don't, right? That there's just a tremendous amount of secrecy. And even when we say, oh, okay, well, where are we at war? What wars are we involved in right now? Mm-hmm. Americans can barely answer that question.
Yeah.
And so this is one thing I would say. Libertarians are overwhelmingly in favor of closing many, if not all, of our bases abroad. And this gets us actually right back to the 9/11 question, because there's at least a very plausible story to tell that 9/11 was simply backlash from the U.S. just willy-nilly, establishing bases all over the world and then kind of saying, deal with it. And people being unwilling to deal with it. Yeah.
If you take bin Laden at his word, that was what he was attacking us for.
Yes.
Or at least one of the big reasons.
And we needn't take bin Laden exclusively at his word, but I think that's clearly a big part of it.
Yeah.
And actually, in a recent issue of Reason Magazine, my colleague Matt Welsh has written about the U.S.'s role in in the Middle East in this same context, right? I mean, the U.S. is so involved and so entangled and so present in so many nations that have been in conflict for decades. And it seems quite clear that our presence there is not making things better, and maybe certainly making things worse for the people there, making things worse for us too. And so I think, the idea of stuff like the drone program, of stuff like sending in small teams and then we always have a new name for like a bunch of Marines that are going to go in and like not officially be there, right? But like the U.S. sort of fiddling on the margins, which Obama did specialize in. I mean,
that's absolutely right.
That was a thing that he leaned into, if anything, was the kind of below the radar interference. I think that has proven to have sometimes quite dire consequences.
At the risk of drawing too many comparisons to other major former presidents. So let's take Trump and his position on NATO, which is not to say the United States should not be in NATO. I mean, he said many things, and I don't want to try and...
when you said, let's take Trump's position, I was like, I don't know what it is.
Let's pick one out of a box. But... for instance, I mean, John Bolton, his former national security advisor, has said that, he felt that Trump wanted to get out of NATO. And I think he has said that he feels that Trump would withdraw from NATO if he were reelected. Is the libertarian position that would be a good idea or a bad idea? Or can you not define it so simply as good or bad?
I mean, there's a joke about, if you put two libertarians on a desert island, you're going to get three kinds of libertarianism, right? And so this is borrowed from other jokes. But so there's going to be many different answers to this question. But I do think that one kind of tenet of libertarianism, or one lens through which to view some of these questions, is you always want to devolve decision-making to the lowest possible level, because that's the place where people understand the stakes the most. So sometimes that's the individual, but in cases where it isn't the individual, you still would prefer local government to state government to federal government to global institutions. And so NATO is a good example of some questions that NATO deals with truly are the concern of all of the nations involved. But some questions that NATO deals with are actually regional conflicts. Yeah. And really, especially not the U.S.'s business. When they are happening kind of overseas at a level that is not global, and so I do think that there is a case to say, where possible, we shouldn't make a global case out of it, and I think that we do see this in the debates about, well, what are the U.S.'s obligations under NATO, or how many more nations should be let into NATO, that kind of thing. Well, if you're going to make everything the concern of the U.S., which is what that would fundamentally do, does that get those issues resolved more rapidly and more justly, or not? And it's not clear to me that that's the case. So I would say the way that Trump did it, or would do it, is almost certainly going to be a disaster. It doesn't mean that he's wrong. In the same way that like Joe Biden really screwed up in many ways getting out of Afghanistan. Right. It was still right to get out of Afghanistan. Right. In my view, and I think in most libertarians' view. Likewise, I don't think we should wake up tomorrow and renege on all of our NATO obligations, but I do think we should be asking the question, is this the U.S.'s business about a lot of conflicts? And I think the answer is frequently no.
Is there a strain in libertarianism of people who are drawn to Trump, or is he pretty roundly, rejected by most people who would call themselves libertarians?
So the Libertarian Party, so capital L Libertarian, their convention was here in Washington, D.C. at the end of May. And they invited Donald Trump to speak, which is
yes, that's right.
It's a weird flex, right? Like, usually you don't invite the candidate of a rival party to speak at your convention. He came, he spoke. There was a lot of controversy over the invitation, and most of the headlines afterwards were "Libertarians boo Donald Trump."
Right.
So I think that captures some of the ambiguity. There are some libertarians who are attracted to Donald Trump, or who would say, if it's a binary choice, we would favor Trump over Biden. There are many, many more libertarians who would say he's an authoritarian asshole.
Yeah,
I would say he's just not a libertarian president. He didn't operate as a libertarian. He sometimes does things that are libertarian,
right?
But it feels like it's almost by accident.
Yeah.
I think his foreign policy was erratic at best, as you documented over the years, and certainly did not show any kind of overarching understanding that was recognizably libertarian to me. But neither has Joe Biden.
Yeah, and when Trump spoke at the convention, I think he drew loud boos because he said libertarians should join me and vote for me, right?
Yes, he did say that. But he was booed also just for a variety of his public policy moves. So he did say that he would put libertarians in his cabinet if elected. He also said that he would consider, there are a few kind of special cases that libertarians are very interested, including Julian Assange's case and Russ Albrecht, who is serving 4 life sentences for operating the Silk Road website,
right.
The dark web website. Trump made some promises on that front. No particular reason to think that he would keep them. But he, he understood a few of the things that he should say for that crowd, and also said, "Leave your girl and run away with me,"
right,
at the Libertarian Convention, which is crazy. The nominee for the Libertarian Party is Chase Oliver, who is seems to be a fairly reasonable dude.
Yeah. What is the libertarian position on Julian Assange?
Let him out.
Yeah.
Free Assange.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it that he was operating as a journalist? Is that generally
yes.
First Amendment protected?
Libertarians love free speech.
Yeah.
Love it. Like, Voltaire levels of, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. I guess Voltaire didn't really say that, actually, but it doesn't matter. The percentage of people you will find who identify as libertarians and also identify as something like free speech absolutists is very, very high.
Okay.
So not only a huge respect for press freedom and a huge disrespect for government secrecy, right? So like if you want to keep this a secret, absolutely not.
Right.
So in general, Assange is going to be kind of a positive figure for those folks, but also a sense that in some ways an even more extreme sense that like the press shouldn't have any special protections because everyone should have free speech rights. Everyone should have the same extremely high level of protection for especially speech criticizing the state, which is, by the way, the whole point of the First Amendment. Right?
Yeah. I'm curious, because looking at this as a journalist, and I'd love to hear what you think about this also just as a journalist. The thing that has probably disturbed me the most about Julian Assange's case in the past few years is, and I was actually in the room for this speech when Mike Pompeo gave this one. I think he may have been CIA director at the time, but before he was Secretary of State, where they started describing WikiLeaks as essentially an entity of a hostile foreign intelligence service, right? And where you're making this, he was making this comparison between journalism, and we can have a debate about whether what Julian Assange was doing was journalism or journalism as it would be practiced by the Washington Post or whatever. But to start equating this organization to a hostile foreign intelligence service and everything that would go with that, that felt to me like a real just sea change in the government's regard of the First Amendment. And I felt like people kind of slept on that a little bit. I mean, one thing that this is related, because it's Assange's case. I'm deeply concerned that if Donald Trump is reelected, his attorney general will decide at some point to prosecute a journalist under the Espionage Act. And I mean like someone like me, who does publish fairly often classified information, which is a crime in the Espionage Act that does not make exemptions for people who work at the Washington Post.
Yes. So the problem there is the existence of the Espionage Act,
right.
obviously. But I think that this is really worth reiterating because in recent years, I think in general, not just in the Assange case, but really across the board, we've seen I would describe it this way. There's a politician who wants to do something, and maybe it's at the behest of the general public or maybe just a hobby horse. They try out a bunch of justifications for what they want to do. And lately, you are acting at the behest of a foreign power argument is really hitting. So I'm thinking here of stuff like the TikTok quasi-ban.
Right.
Like they tried a bunch of stuff. Like a bunch of people wanted to ban TikTok or severely curtail it. And first they were like, oh, it's making the teen girls sad. And people were like, we do like to do laws to protect the children. But then it was like, But then it was like, oh, it's China. And people were like, that's the one.
That one sticks.
That's hitting. And I think you see that in a lot of public policy conversations where this sort of boogeyman of foreign influence is increasingly kind of a slam dunk on the Hill to move a bill through. People don't want to be seen as being soft on China or soft on whoever. This is, all the more reason, from my perspective, to just disentangle a little bit from the world. And I guess I should say, because I've been sort of repeatedly saying this throughout the course of our conversation, I really do want to make a distinction between military engagement abroad and trade. Free minds and free markets means free trade.
Free trade. About that.
And I think that the rise of global trade in the last 200 years has been kind of unambiguously the most powerful force for good maybe that humanity has ever stumbled across. And I just want to state that as strongly as possible.
We're talking lifting billions of people out of poverty, technological innovation, all that comes with
literacy rates, women's liberation, drinkable water, just standard of living. There has been a miracle of the improvement in the human lot that is down to just the movement of people and goods across borders. And so for that reason, when we talk about foreign policy, one thing that sometimes gets used as a compromise position is, let's just do sanctions. Let's just do a trade war instead of a war. And I think it's really important to say, A, that those are not effective tools in many, many cases. I mean, I think, we've seen the sanctions on Russia that we're talking about right now that are underway. I don't know. It's made some people mad, but did we significantly hamper Russia's ability to pursue military action?
Nope.
I don't think so. The sanctions on Iran that we have had for, on and off in various guises, embargoes, all that kind of stuff, it hurts regular people. It radicalizes regular people in other nations against the U.S. I mean, you see this especially in Latin America. The economic woes of Venezuelans and whatever, they're constantly being blamed on the U.S. Cuba famously has blamed their horrific, disastrous, crushing poverty on the U.S. for decades. So, I think keeping trade as free as possible is a super important way of being engaged in the world, and that too often we are willing to forfeit that and also set up our bases or pick our fights or whatever it is abroad in ways that are really unproductive.
You mentioned Russia and Ukraine. What is the libertarian? I feel like I'm asking you, what is the libertarian take on that?
I'm happy to be the spokescow. I will say, libertarians love to get mad at other libertarians. So, I hope everybody writes into you and is super mad. You can just send them to me.
I'm going to send them straight to you.
Happy to answer questions, my fellow libertarians.
Put your email in the show notes. But the libertarian position on U.S. support for Ukraine.
So, I think most libertarians would say, first of all, that the Ukrainians are totally justified in their self-defense, right? So that's the first thing. It's this is, unlike so many other conflicts, including of course, the conflict in Israel, this is really clear cut.
Yeah.
Ukrainians have been attacked. Their sovereignty has been undermined by Putin, who is in the wrong. They have every right to fight tooth and nail with anything that they can get their hands on. So I think, first of all, there's that kind of the moral question. But then there's the question of the U.S.'s involvement. And, I think that this is a case where I would say, again, what is the story that we're telling about the reason the U.S. should be involved? And the story might be the cause is just and we should do it. But we've seen how that turns out in Iraq and other places. Cause is just, I think, is not enough. I think there's if Putin continues to grow in power, he could nuke us. So it's a self-defense case. Some people do buy that case. I think it's a little tricky to make that case here. If he's going to nuke us, he's going to nuke us. Yeah. Whether or not he holds Ukraine is a little secondary.
Sure.
But then I think there's the question of there's a lot of gray area between sending in American troops to do the fighting and offering kind of diplomatic support, selling weapons, giving weapons. My general view is that, I would love to see an alternate world in which there's actually just global weapons markets that are a little bit more like other types of markets. I would love for Ukraine to just be able to buy weapons from us and we could choose who to sell them to. But I think, again, to me, the question is what are we going to not do if we're going to spend a lot of money supporting Ukraine in this conflict? Yes, their fight is just. Yes, we do have resources that they could use, but we also are out of money. And we do not have a plan for how we're going to balance our budget. We are borrowing money at an insane rate that exposes us to all kinds of other risks. I'm open to a debate about giving or selling them weapons, but what are we going to not do to pay for that? And that's never how the conversation goes.
Yeah.
It's always yes and. It's always more. And so, in theory, that would be the role of Congress, where you could have that debate and you could create budgets that are real.
Right.
In practice, none of that happens. So until we can get to a place where that happens, my general feeling is we should actually withdraw from that conflict and not be a part of provisioning it either.
Do you buy the idea that if we pull back, then Putin next goes for Poland and it's a march of authoritarianism across Europe, and we have an interest in preventing that?
Maybe. I mean, that's our collective global trauma.
Yeah.
Right. Is the fear of that thing happening.
Yeah. And we've seen it recently.
And we've seen it.
Yeah.
And so it's not a totally unfounded fear, but I do also think it is something of a boogeyman. It is something of a speculative case when right here and right now the sort of concrete case for why the U.S. needs to be involved to the tune of billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. It just seems a little tenuous to me.
Yeah. What do you think of as the role for the magazine that you edit, Reason Magazine? What is the role for it in espousing, defending, explaining libertarian ideas to people?
So we see ourselves as doing journalism where we wear our ideological biases on our sleeves, right? And I would argue all journalists have biases. Everybody is coming in with priors, lenses through which they view the world.
Yeah.
At Reason, we say, hey, the lens through which we view the world is free minds and free markets, is libertarianism. Yeah. And so we want to tell you stories about places that liberty is under threat. We want to tell you stories about public policy alternatives that might make the world more free or more fair or more fun or whatever. We want to tell you stories of the fruits of free minds and free markets. So sometimes what we're doing is just saying hey, did you know this cool new thing is happening in the world, and it's happening because of global trade, or it's happening because of free speech, or it's happening because of a culture of enterprise that we should treasure in the United States. So some of it is storytelling in that way. Some of it is argumentation about whatever the hot topic of the day is. we do not really see ourselves as like a newsletter for the libertarian world.
Right.
So we're not looking to kind of cover things internal to libertarianism. We're looking to do journalism that hopefully is interesting to people who just want to know what's going on in the world and are kind of interested to hear what the world looks like through our eyes.
You've worked at the New York Times, and so you've worked in big mainstream media. Does it annoy you when journalists, including people who work where I work, try to pretend that we've left our biases at the door?
Oh my God. I mean, I do think that actually the ground has shifted a little bit on this. And I'm not sure that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I will say, like, I think when I was starting out, there was more of that. There was more of journalists who were like, it's the view from God. I leave all my biases at the door.
Vote. Yeah.
I don't vote. Or if I do vote, I'm not going to tell you how I voted, which somehow projects my objectivity, which is crazy.
Yeah.
I think now people are more likely to say, oh, yeah, I have a bias. And unfortunately, that's like tipped right over into like journalism as social justice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
we're becoming part of the culture war within a newsroom.
It turns out that's not good either.
Yeah.
Right. So in some ways, even though I think it was always kind of garbage, I do have a little nostalgia for the hypocrisy of the journalists who asserted their own pure objectivity.
Yeah.
I still think, that Reason Magazine's way of doing it is a good solution. Like, put your bias on the table, acknowledge that you're doing journalism from a perspective, and if people want to mix, they can subscribe to Mother Jones and The Nation and Jacobin also.
Right. And I think that, I was having a conversation with somebody recently who's not a journalist and who was asking me, was Walter Cronkite the height of American journalism and objectivity? I'm like, well, I think you could argue that the Walter Cronkite approach to journalism is an aberration in the history of American journalism, which has frequently been partisan and blood-curdling and commercial and tabloid. It's been all those things. And I think that sometimes the kind of quote-unquote objective journalism that my employer in the New York Times and others are trying to espouse, I think as, kind of disingenuous as that is, not because I think we have a secret agenda, it's just we're human beings. Journalism is a subjective exercise. What you choose to put in a lead is a subjective exercise. I'm saying I think this is the most important thing. I nevertheless think that it's something to strive for because it at least tells people, all right, you're not picking a side. You're just trying to give me the information as straight as you can. But I've always felt like there's completely a role for a magazine like Reason because you should want to know what people who are openly telling you I see the world through this lens, what they're thinking. That is the role of magazines, right? Magazines orient and explain the world and often do it visually and with style and with panache, and they're a delight to read for that reason. And I think not everyone should be striving to be the kind of publication I work for. It's and frankly, most American publications have been more like the one you work for. That's what the magazine business is.
Yeah,
and it's fun.
It is. First of all, it is fun. I certainly find it fun, but I also think there's, when we talk about the Walter Cronkite moment, the Walter Cronkite era.
Yeah.
I also think there's there's this feeling that somehow he was at all successful, or that the journalists of his era were at all successful in capturing the world. And in fact, that was one of the narrowest, kind of most bottlenecked eras of media history ever.
Yeah,
Very few channels, very few kind of dominant players. And
3 massive corporate-owned broadcasting networks.
There's, I think a thing that is really great about the current media landscape is that it's bonkers. Mm-hmm. You can get anything. You can get anything you want. And I think that there's a temptation to be like, oh, God, if only people could be a little more civilized and we could have higher standards. Sure. But as you say, all you have to do is look at the kind of the founding era press to see that there's scrappy partisan media is nothing new. And also that it's better if people can really see the truth about what's out there.
Yeah.
The Cronkite era was always a pretense that somehow there was a single mainstream culture and that we all agreed. We never all agreed.
Right, no.
And we never all even bought the idea that there was all the news that was fit to print. We never bought the idea that that's the way it is, But people didn't know how to find alternatives, or it wasn't as easy to find alternatives, and now it is.
Yeah, and we didn't need to agree. And this is something that it strikes me is that there seems to be this desire right now to get everyone to just agree. And we've always lived in a fractured society. My question, I guess this is a big one for you, where do you come down on the spectrum of, and you posited with Donald Trump's reelection, if you want to take a dive, because that's the easiest one. I mean, are we on the brink of a democratic collapse here and the rise of authoritarianism? I mean, do you take a kind of very dim, pessimistic view on where we're heading possibly in November, or are we more resilient than that and we should be giving ourselves a little more credit?
So I would take, I guess, a slightly longer view than this November framework. And I think that you can actually find both of these threads within libertarianism itself. So I'll answer it that way.
Yeah.
And there's one kind of school of libertarianism that says, look around us, we are more regulated and more taxed and more hemmed in by the state and by the powers that be than ever before. We have more laws, more rules, more regulations. We are unfree because of the growth of the state, right? The size of the U.S. federal government is unprecedentedly huge and complex, undoubtedly.
Yep.
So there's one story that says, we've built this incredible apparatus. Each successive president has the incredible authoritarian power at his fingertips. It's Chekhov's gun, and it will be fired, and maybe it has been fired already by Donald Trump. Right? That's a story you can tell. The other story you can tell is the last many decades have been a story of people being able to increasingly live out their own choices and their own lives as they see fit. And we have become a nation that respects civil rights and civil liberties in unprecedented ways, and women and gays and people of all races and immigrants are freer than they have ever been, and we have more choices in the marketplace and more mobility in where we live and what jobs we work and what technologies we can use and the things we can buy, and that we have more ability to communicate with each other and more freedom to communicate with each other than we ever have. And we are richer than we have ever been. We have so many resources to live out our lives however we see fit. And we're freer than we've ever been. And we just keep getting freer and freer. And yes, politics sucks, but who cares? Because look at the lives we lead.
Yeah.
And I think both of those stories are true stories.
Yeah.
Dispositionally, I'm an optimist. So the story I emotionally invest in is the one in which we are getting freer and freer, and the world really is getting better and better, and even Donald Trump can't take that away from me.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump does want to take that away from me.
He has said it.
And so does Joe Biden. Yeah. And, I don't want to do a both sidesism here because I do think there are really important differences, but from the libertarian perspective, it is the holders of political power, regardless of their partisan affiliation, against whom we must be on guard.
Yeah.
Because they will abuse that power and they will grow that power. And in so doing, they will make people's lives less good.
Yeah. Well, being a listener of the podcast, you know that the last question that I'm going to ask you is in the chatter box. You're excited.
Ready.
You're ready for it. So in here, probably there might be about 10 or so questions in here. I'm going to choose one at random for you.
I wish that the listeners could see the box.
It's an actual box.
It's so beautiful.
It's a cute box. And there's more than one box because when we record from a remote location, there's a box there as well. Okay. Here's your question. In what country other than your own would you most like to live and why?
So I sometimes get this question in a slightly different form, which is, what is the most libertarian country?
Oh, okay. You can answer both if you want.
And my answer to that question is the United States. That even for all of its flaws, that actually this is the freest country in the world, and that I would not want to live anywhere other than here. But if I have to live somewhere else, I guess my answer is Well, can I answer a non-state answer?
Yes.
Okay.
A fictional state?
No.
Okay.
So you may know that libertarians have kind of, there's like an experiments in living thread in libertarianism. And one way that manifests is that libertarians are always trying to create things that are outside of governments entirely, like new entities. So you might have heard of like seasteading, where, you have like a floating polity out in international waters. There's the people who like tried to do a state on an abandoned oil platform. There was a thing years ago where they like just built up a sandbar and they were like, this is a new country, a cruise ship. So libertarians are always just trying to like get away from government entirely. Right now, there's kind of a big movement that's called charter cities or sometimes startup cities. And there's one in Honduras on the island of Roatan called Prospera.
Sounds enticing.
And it's a semi-autonomous city that's established under a ZID, which is basically just means that it's sort of primarily it's primarily autonomous. So it is in Honduras, but it is not really governed by Honduras.
Okay.
And instead, if you go there, you can choose from a bunch of different legal orders to live under and to establish your business under and to kind of function.
Do they compete with one another?
They compete with one another internally, and there's sort of systems for resolving conflict. It is very small and very new, and if any of the other prior experiments in living are a precedent, it won't last long. But I think it's really cool. This, of course, you also hear this sometimes. The more ambitious versions of these are sometimes, in space.
Yeah.
None of those exist yet.
Right.
But, so if I must leave the United States,
it will be for prosperity.
I'm off to a ZID. I'm off to a charter city or a startup city of some kind.
Would you start your own?
It seems like a lot of work.
It can't be as hard as running a magazine.
It's pretty. I was just going to say, I think I have enough on my plate wrangling my colleagues at Reason Magazine. Yeah. I don't know that I can run a quasi-state entity.
Yeah. You're running a zine, not a ZID.
Oh,
damn.
See what you did there.
Yeah, excellent. Katherine Mangu-Ward, my dear friend, thank you so much for coming on. This was super fun.
Thank you for having me.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.